Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we'll be doing a feed drop where I will be previewing another podcast I have in the works. Today's episode will be from Nihonshi, a Japanese history podcast, which will launch in 2026. This show will be written and produced by me, and in it I'll be doing deep dives into historical episodes of Japanese history. We'll be discussing topics in Japanese history and diving deep into their circumstances, their context, and their significance. We'll talk about who the major players were, what their agendas were, and why they did what they did. Hopefully by the end of each episode, you'll have a better understanding and appreciation of Japanese history, but also East Asian history in general. In addition, this show will also have a Patreon. If you simply can't wait for new episodes, and you would like to get access to early episodes, bonus episodes, and other member bonuses, you can back us on Patreon at patreon.com/Nihonshi podcast. This Patreon page is not live yet, but it will go live whenever Nihonshi releases. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy Nihonshi, a Japanese history podcast. Hello and welcome to Nihonshi, a Japanese history podcast. Today we'll be embarking on a multi-part series on the Genpei War, which lasted from 1180 to 1185 CE. It was fought between the rival Taira and Minamoto clans, the two most powerful political factions in Heian period Japan, and it ushered in the end of the Heian period, known for being a classical age of Japanese culture and literature, and the beginning of the Kamakura period, so named for the military government, or Bakufu, set up in what is now the city of Kamakura. This episode will focus on the decades of political tensions and rebellions leading up to the outbreak of the war, and its first encounter on the river Uji. The story of this war is retold in one of the most famous works of Japanese literature, the Tale of Heikei, known in Japanese as Heikei Monogatari. This text was compiled in the first half of the 14th century by many authors. The name Heikei in the title of the Tale of Heikei refers to the Taira clan. Another way to read Taira is Hei, and the way to indicate a clan or a family is the suffix Kei. So, the Tale of Heikei is about them. The purpose of its compilation and authorship was allegedly to placate the unrestful spirits of the losers of the Genpei War. This story attempted to give honor and due respect and credit to the Taira family so that their vengeful spirits wouldn't come back and wreak havoc on society for years to come. This is one of the most exciting moments in Japanese history and is retold in one of the most engaging tales in Japanese literature, and I can't wait to get started. To set the stage for this conflict, we should at least discuss what's at stake and why everybody who's involved wants what's at stake. So, what's at stake is a seat or control over the seat of the Japanese imperial throne. At this time, this meant control over basically the entire southern half of present-day Japan. The regions to the far north had not yet fully been incorporated into what we now think of as Japan. For example, the island of Hokkaido was not part of Japan at this time. The same can be said for Okinawa, which was called Ryukyu. The major players are going to be the Fujiwara clan, as I mentioned, the most powerful and most influential clan that is the closest to the imperial family and has some of the strongest military forces. And between those two, there's going to be split allyships between the Minamoto clan and the Taira clan. These are two very noble and very old and very storied families that have very large military forces, that have a great deal of power, wealth, and influence, and both want to exert control over the imperial throne. However, when this story begins, these two clans are going to be on the same sides with each other, but on opposite sides of a conflict. And the reason why is that they will both ally with an emperor, or at least someone with a claim to the imperial throne, who will want to supplant whoever's there and implement their own system and be able to control the imperial succession with their own children. After the outcome of that conflict, we will see then the roots of discord between the two clans, Taira and Minamoto. However, as the war goes on, we will still see these different allegiances and alliances forming across these clan boundaries. And the reason why is mostly related to who has the most momentum and who is winning the war at a given time. But it also has to do with issues of individual conscience. It has to do with issues of family relationships, and it has to do with outcomes of battles or of other skirmishes, and that will cause people to change sides throughout this war. It will get confusing and it will get difficult, not only to remember who's on what side, but also to keep track of all of these names. However, the important players will come up enough that you'll be able to start to trace their narratives throughout the course of this entire war. Let's get into it. So, let's get our bearings. We'll be starting in 1156 with a succession crisis and a rebellion. The capital is Heian-kyo, present-day Kyoto, and it has been since 794. The name Heian-kyo was given to the city because it means something like peaceful capital or tranquil capital, referring to the civil unrest and conflicts that the imperial family attempted to settle by its founding. In this time period, there was an explosion of courtly literature. The tales of Issei, the tales of times now past, and the tale of Genji were all authored and compiled during this time period. The most powerful clan in the imperial court is the Fujiwara clan, who had served as hereditary imperial regents and chief advisors to the throne for centuries. They were descendants of the imperial family, and they also had an ancestor kami named in the Nihonshoki and in the Kojiki. They maintained their close relationship to the imperial family by intermarrying and brokering political power in the imperial court. The other two notable clans in the court that we ought to mention are the Minamoto and Taira clans, the two combatants of the Genpei War. The character Gen in the word Genpei refers to the Minamoto clan's name, and the character Pei refers to the Taira clan's family name. The Minamoto clan is sometimes called the family of Genji, as in Genji from the tale of Genji some years later. The Minamoto and Taira clans are very interesting because they're not singular family lines. During this time period, clans were made up primarily of family members that shared a family name and shared blood relation, but the clan also included allies, it included cadet branches of the family, it included warriors and retainers, and it included anybody who had been bestowed the name Taira or Minamoto by the heads of the clans, either for acts of valor or acts of loyalty, or by the imperial family for being excluded from the lines of succession and being demoted to the rank of nobles. Thus, these two clans are actually distantly related to each other, and also to the emperor and to the Fujiwara clan, which sows the seeds of ambition for total power over the throne, but also for a great deal of interfamily conflict. During the Heian period, the samurai or military class of society was on the rise. We will do an episode on the myth of the samurai, but for now, I'll give the short version. The short version is that there was a great deal of decentralization of political and military power in the Heian period. This means that most of the power over any given parcel of land did not lie with the emperor or with the imperial family. It lied with samurai, with nobles, or with aristocracy that did have some relationship to the emperor, but they often engaged in lots of political squabbles and civil wars and skirmishes with each other, jockeying for more land and resources, and trying to get closer and closer to the throne. As for armies, there had been a conscription system, but it broke down with the turn of the Heian period in the 790s, and so many nobles scattered all over Japan began to hire, train, and outfit their own military forces, and these mercenary-type figures were what we now call the samurai. These nobles themselves also trained and outfitted themselves, transforming the provincial upper class into a class of essentially warlords with land grants from the emperor and companies of fighters on retainer. In this sense, loyalty and honor only went as far as survival and financial compensation were basically guaranteed. As we will see, loyalty and honor and all of these other blown-up virtues of the samurai class that we imagine them to embody were all not nearly as big of a deal as samurai movies and shows make them out to be. We'll see a famous example of samurai switching sides in a battle that's not going their way, thoroughly disproving the idea that honor and loyalty were important among the samurai at this time period. Now let's move back to the imperial court, where a lot of the political intrigue that's going to lead to this war is brewing. Meet Emperor Toba, the 74th emperor of Japan. He ruled from 1107 until his abdication in 1123. He had 3 empresses, many consorts, and 14 sons and daughters. Let's take a look at 3 of his sons, Prince Akihito, Masahito, and Narihito. These 3 sons were born to 2 different Fujiwara women, Akihito and Masahito by Fujiwara no Tamako, and Narihito by Fujiwara no Nariko. Although Toba abdicated in 1123, the system of the Japanese imperial court was such that these retired emperors were still able to pull some levers of power from behind the scenes, even if they were retired. This system was called the cloistered rule system. So, when Toba abdicated, his son Akihito ascended the throne and became Emperor Sutoku. However, Toba forced him to abdicate so that Narihito, Sutoku's half-brother and the son of Toba's favored consort Fujiwara no Nariko, could ascend the throne. He would become Emperor Konoe, who would reign from 1142 until 1155 when he died. Sutoku had always resented this move and felt it a personal slight on him and his mother, Fujiwara no Tamako. He had hoped to regain power and prestige after Konoe's death, hoping that one of his sons would ascend the throne. Instead, Sutoku was further frustrated when his younger brother Masahito ascended the throne in 1155 instead and became one of the biggest power brokers in this entire narrative, Emperor Go-Shirakawa. This is where things get very interesting. We now have two factions, those who support Toba and Go-Shirakawa, and those who support Sutoku. Supporters of each one fall according to these different clan loyalties. Both the mothers of Go-Shirakawa and Sutoku were indeed Fujiwaras, but there were different factions even within the Fujiwara clan that led to these different people having different support and different allies in the court. So, Toba dies 1 year into Go-Shirakawa's reign, and Go-Shirakawa and Sutoku assemble their forces to fight it out. They're going to figure out who's going to take the throne. Sutoku wants to install one of his own sons on the throne, and Go-Shirakawa wants to maintain power and remain on the throne. Additionally, Sutoku wanted to end his cloistered rule system that gave Toba all this power for contesting succession of the throne and essentially installing who he wanted as emperor in the first place. So, who did they call in their support? None other than the Minamoto and Taira clans. Minamoto no Tameyoshi and Taira no Tadamasa side with Sutoku, and their goal is to overthrow or remove Go-Shirakawa and install one of Sutoku's sons, who they're allied with. Minamoto no Yoshitomo, son of Tameyoshi, and Taira no Kiyomori side with Go-Shirakawa. They want Go-Shirakawa to maintain his power on the throne and potentially also have his sons succeed him. It's confusing at this stage, but for now just remember that there were Taira and Minamoto clan members on both sides of this conflict. Right now, the main succession crisis is between Sutoku and Go-Shirakawa, because Sutoku feels like he should have ascended the throne, and Go-Shirakawa ascended instead. In 1156, these forces faced off with each other in Kyoto. In a rather funny story, both sides consider a nighttime surprise attack on the other, but only Go-Shirakawa's forces, led by Minamoto no Yoshitomo and Taira no Kiyomori, go through with it. On the night of July 27th and 28th of 1156, Kiyomori and Yoshitomo took around 600 cavalrymen and attacked Sutoku in what would come to be called the Siege of Shirakawa-den, another name for a palace hall named for the former Emperor Shirakawa. Go-Shirakawa literally means later Shirakawa, and Emperor Shirakawa ruled earlier in the 11th century. Taira no Kiyomori attacked the west gate where Minamoto no Tametomo and his men defended with famous archery units. Tametomo held off Kiyomori's forces. Then Minamoto no Yoshitomo attacked Tametomo, but he was also held off. Yoshitomo eventually suggested that his force set the palace hall on fire. He saw that things weren't going his way, and he thought that this was probably the best, quickest, easiest solution. Once this was done, then Sutoku's forces were divided, fighting fire in the Shirakawa-den and fighting Go-Shirakawa's forces out on the battlefield. Sutoku's forces retreated, and Go-Shirakawa had won. Thus, Go-Shirakawa kept his reign for the moment, and he also kept the cloistered rule system, which allowed retired emperors to maintain power. And Sutoku and his forces were all exiled. Many leaders of the Taira and Minamoto clans who had divided their loyalties between Sutoku and Go-Shirakawa died in the battle or were executed. Specifically, Minamoto no Tameyoshi and Taira no Tadamasa were executed for rebelling with Sutoku. So the Minamoto clan head became Minamoto no Yoshitomo, and the head of the Taira clan became Taira no Kiyomori. These two are going to be the most important characters for at least the first part of the Genpei War narrative. Minamoto no Yoshitomo and Taira no Kiyomori. Them and their sons are going to be the biggest combatants, and they're going to be the ones that struggle against each other for power and influence over the imperial throne. After the outcome of the siege of Shirakawa-den, you can see the first seeds of rivalry between the Minamoto and Taira clans begin to take root. These two clans had earned the favor of Emperor Go-Shirakawa for putting down what would eventually come to be called the Hogen Rebellion, and it served each one to further ingratiate themselves with Go-Shirakawa and simultaneously hamstring the other. Both clans wanted to get the chance to marry one of their children to a member of the imperial family, to earn titles, land, and wealth for themselves, and to amass power and influence over the throne for the execution of their own interests. So the rivalry between the two clans was already seeded in many ways, but it's also quite clear that the Taira clan was rewarded far more than the Minamoto clan for their actions in putting down the rebellion. Taira no Kiyomori was clearly becoming highly rated by Go-Shirakawa for his military prowess, his youth and his vigor, and his ruthlessness in his loyalty to the throne, and the new leader of the Minamoto clan, Yoshitomo, was getting very upset about things. He was getting very upset at having to execute his father and his brothers for being loyal to Sutoku, and he was very annoyed that Taira no Kiyomori was the golden child of the throne. Yoshitomo thought that the Minamoto clan had given just as much, if not more, when it came to those that supported Go-Shirakawa on his side of the rebellion, or when it came to taking punishment for the outcome of the rebellion. To make things even more wrinkly, Go-Shirakawa himself was a very interesting and elusive figure in Japanese history. He did not seem to want to rule as emperor for very long. He abdicated in 1158 after only 3 years of rule to become a cloistered emperor. This was a position that many historians argue was no longer secure due to the rising power of the samurai class, as retired Emperor Sutoku himself had got overthrown by samurai forces supported by the sitting emperor. This demonstrates how powerful samurai classes were becoming in the Heian period, such that they could even begin to threaten the imperial ruling system of the time, the cloistered rule system. However, we will see that Go-Shirakawa is a very wily and conniving guy who's always seemingly living on the edge. He maintained his cloistered emperor status through 5 successive emperors all the way until his death in 1192. He wielded the real power in the palace during this time, and he was not above switching sides, pitting his subordinates against each other, and playing a little dirty to get what he wanted. Upon his abdication, Go-Shirakawa's son, Morihito, ascended the throne and became Emperor Nijo in 1158, with Fujiwara no Nobuyori as a chief advisor. Now, so far I've not been talking very much about the Fujiwara regents and courtiers because they have thus far been a layer of complication that makes this narrative so much harder to understand. They are more non-Western names to remember for my native English-speaking listeners, and they are also changing sides, and just because you know that they're part of the Fujiwara clan doesn't tell you which side of any given conflict that they're actually on. However, Fujiwara no Nobuyori steps into this narrative as a very powerful and deceptive figure who stood strongly against Go-Shirakawa on the side of the Minamoto clan. As we've been saying, Go-Shirakawa maintains a great deal of power as a cloistered emperor. Under Nijo, the Minamoto continued to feel that the Taira clan was being treated with unfair favor. This led to Minamoto no Yoshitomo allying with Fujiwara no Nobuyori, and the tensions between their faction and the other faction, with Go-Shirakawa and Taira no Kiyomori, boiled over in what would come to be called the Heiji Rebellion, or the Heiji Incident, so named for the calendar year in which it happened. In 1159, Taira no Kiyomori left the capital to make pilgrimage to Kumano, a very popular Buddhist and Shinto pilgrimage site, and Minamoto no Yoshitomo and Fujiwara no Nobuyori made their move. In January and February of 1160, Minamoto Yoshitomo and the Fujiwara clan's forces laid siege to the Sanjo Palace, the residence of Go-Shirakawa, and they burned it down. They kidnapped Go-Shirakawa and they killed the Fujiwara elements who had allied with the Taira clan. They then took Go Shirakawa to the imperial palace in Kyoto and placed him and his son Emperor Nijo under house arrest, and Fujiwara no Nobuyori, who had allied with the Minamoto, had himself declared imperial chancellor by Emperor Nijo. He essentially held a blade to Nijo's throat and said, "Make me the chancellor or I'll kill you." Thus you can see that this was a power grab not just for the Minamoto clan allied under Minamoto no Yoshitomo, but it was also a power grab for Fujiwara elements who had backed Nobuyori as well. Taira no Kiyomori heard of all this and quickly returned to the capital with his full outfit of soldiers and retainers. Minamoto no Yoshitomo was not prepared for him to get home early, and so he couldn't put down the Taira forces. Historian George Sansom argues that it's possible that Kiyomori actually left to set a trap for the Minamoto forces so that he could catch them red-handed trying to seize the throne and have an excuse to put them down. But this is not likely. At the same time, Kiyomori was seemingly alarmed at the size of Minamoto's forces and tried to make peace with Nobuyori from a defensive position in their estate in Kyoto called Rokuhara. While these talks were somewhat stagnated, Emperor Nijo supposedly disguised himself as a lady-in-waiting and escaped to the Taira estate with Go Shirakawa. Some have argued that Kiyomori's peace talks with Nobuyori were a ruse to distract Fujiwara forces while the emperor and his father escaped their imprisonment. But this also seems unlikely because the combined forces of Minamoto and Fujiwara no Nobuyori were no doubt remarkably larger than Taira no Kiyomori's upon his return to the capital, since he had left on pilgrimage rather than on military campaign. So, with the Taira clan knocking on the door of the palace, Nobuyori immediately ran away, which is somewhat shocking to believe because his position was still rather strong. He had opponents in the court, but as far as I can tell, he still had the title of chancellor and the power of the combined forces of part of the Fujiwara clan and the entire Minamoto clan. Regardless, Minamoto no Yoshitomo was left somewhat alone, encamped in a defensive position in the palace, and the smaller Taira force had the chance to muster reinforcements, particularly from Taira no Kiyomori's son, Shigemori. There were two main sites of battle. One was at the Taira estate at Rokuhara, and the other was at the imperial palace. At the palace, the Minamoto forces were drawn out by a feigned retreat, and then they were bum-rushed. This forced the Minamoto to make a rush for Rokuhara, but they were defeated by Shigemori's reinforcements, and they were forced into fighting retreat by them and by armed monks from Mount Hiei, a Buddhist monastery to the northeast. Minamoto no Yoshitomo dissolved his forces and struck out eastward with his last remaining sons and retainers. His goal was to muster fresh forces and recuperate, but eventually Yoshitomo had to kill his own injured son Tomonaga to save him from falling into the hands of the enemy, and then Minamoto no Yoshitomo himself died by the hand of one of his retainers. He was survived by 3 sons, Yoritomo, Noriyori, and Yoshitsune. Historians are hesitant to read the Taira and Minamoto clans as the primary instigators and movers in the Heiji and Hogen incidents. They instead see the entire Taira and Minamoto rivalry up to this point in 1159 and 1160 as being a result of the Fujiwara clan trying to amass and consolidate power over the sovereign. However, in so doing, they made use of military companies, in this case the Taira and Minamoto clans, as their means for playing out this conflict. They were the perhaps somewhat unwitting weapons of the Fujiwara, in a manner of speaking. That may be true, but I think that it is also safe to say that Taira no Kiyomori and his clan, his son Shigemori, and his warriors are getting in such good favor with Go Shirakawa that their station has improved certainly far beyond that of the Minamoto, and potentially even beyond that of the Fujiwara. Similarly, we can't deny that there are the roots of rivalry between the Taira and Minamoto clans. In other words, though they are being pitted against each other by the Fujiwara clans, who's to say that they wouldn't have embroiled each other in conflict independent of Fujiwara influence? The Fujiwara gave them an avenue to power, an excuse to fight with each other, and lots of resources, wealth, power, and influence over the sovereign that they could use to their own ends. In that sense, who was using who. Were the Minamoto and Taira clans using the Fujiwara, or were the Fujiwara using the Minamoto and Taira clans? This was a very powerful and mutually beneficial alliance that I think could have shaken out very positively for any of them. Speaking to the fact that the Taira had allied themselves so closely with Go Shirakawa as to even surpass the Fujiwara in terms of influence and favor and closeness to the emperor, we should remember that Go Shirakawa's closest Fujiwara allies were killed in the Heiji incident. Similarly, the Minamoto clan could not be relied on by Go Shirakawa because they had showed their true colors by allying with Nobuyori, trying to supplant imperial power. So at this stage, Go Shirakawa's closest ally is the Taira. In that sense, the Taira had come out more successful in the Taira-Minamoto rivalry. The Minamoto clan was reduced to obscurity, with only the 3 children I mentioned earlier remaining alive. Meanwhile, Go Shirakawa, through Nijo, maintained imperial power, and the Taira clan survived and enjoyed a very close alliance to the retired Emperor Go Shirakawa. At this stage, the story becomes more and more about Taira no Kiyomori. To recap, the Taira clan had begun the narrative as an upper middling or even middling noble aristocratic family, and then whenever the conflict between Go Shirakawa and Sutoku broke out, Taira no Kiyomori allied with Go Shirakawa, and Go Shirakawa came out on top. Then, remaining allies going into the Heiji Rebellion or the Heiji Incident, it was the Taira clan's forces who swooped in and was able to drive out the Minamoto forces, thus further cementing the alliance between Taira and Go Shirakawa and further demonstrating Kiyomori's effectiveness on the battlefield. Meanwhile, on the other side, the Minamoto clans had been treated far worse after the outcome of the Hogen Rebellion and had failed to seize power for themselves even with Fujiwara backing in the Heiji Incident. Because the Heiji Incident had been instigated by a Fujiwara faction to begin with, Go Shirakawa realizes that he may not be able to trust the Fujiwara as much as he had previously thought. However, Taira has shown himself to be very reliable and very loyal. So, Taira no Kiyomori's personal ascent in the palace, and his clan's ascent by extension, continued in the years leading up to the outbreak of the Genpei War. On the one hand, this was because of the favor being showered upon them by Go Shirakawa, but on the other hand, it was due to their political and military skill in dealing with and ultimately overcoming the bureaucracy and the political intrigue of the Fujiwara clan. In 1167, at age 49, Taira no Kiyomori was named chancellor. He held the highest court rank that could be held by somebody who wasn't a member of the imperial family, and he had elbowed the Fujiwara elements in court out of his way. This was all incredibly impressive to all of his contemporaries because he was not noble-born. Go Shirakawa had either directly or indirectly contributed to this ascent, but it's safe to assume that he was getting a little anxious with the monster that he had been creating. Kiyomori repeatedly put his own sons into powerful positions and sought to totally consolidate the rulership of Japan under his own power and influence, or that of his family. Taira no Kiyomori actually married a Taira woman to Go Shirakawa, and this marriage produced a son. This son incidentally became Go Shirakawa's favorite son, and Go Shirakawa made Emperor Nijo and his grandson, Emperor Rokujo, abdicate and step down so that his favorite son could take the throne and become Emperor Takakura. Takakura, being the child of Go Shirakawa and a Taira mother, gave Taira no Kiyomori that much more power and influence over the throne. However, even though Takakura was Go Shirakawa's favorite son and had become emperor, Kiyomori's rapid ascent, his lack of friendship for the Fujiwara, and his newfound station offended the Fujiwara, and it began to offend even cloistered Emperor Go Shirakawa himself. In true Donald Trumpian nepotism, Taira no Kiyomori would post his own sons and family members into these important positions in court and all over the country, and it started to chafe everybody, even one of his biggest allies, Go Shirakawa. This means that here again, Go Shirakawa's alliances are complicated. Why does Kiyomori fall out of favor with him as quickly as he rose to it? I think part of the reason is that Kiyomori started offending Go Shirakawa's Fujiwara allies in court. Kiyomori was seemingly trying to usurp the Fujiwara clan's regency, which offended Go Shirakawa because they were closely intermarried into the imperial family and had been for many years. Additionally, Kiyomori was also trying to usurp the retired emperor's power over affairs at court by exerting his own influence over the emperors themselves. This further offended the entire imperial family. He tried to end the Fujiwara regency, and he tried to end the cloistered emperor system where retired emperors could have so much influence after retiring. This did not go over well, because it was exactly what Go Shirakawa's enemy Sutoku had gotten up to. So relations are souring. We now move to the year 1168. Go Shirakawa's favorite son is now the emperor, Emperor Takakura. Takakura is the child of a Taira mother, which means that Taira no Kiyomori has a great deal of influence over the throne. In his position as chancellor, he is making enemies with the Fujiwara, and he's trying to end the cloistered rule system, which has been propping up Go Shirakawa's power for a couple of decades now. Things are heating up, and you can see that they're about to boil over. In the same year, 1168, Kiyomori actually became very ill, and he took tonsure to become a Buddhist monk. This is something that elder nobles and courtiers very often did near the ends of their careers or the ends of their lives. But as in the case of the cloistered emperor, he continued to maintain a great deal of power and influence over his children and grandchildren, including in particular Emperor Takakura. Go Shirakawa also renounced, which George Sansom believes was due to the fact that he couldn't control Kiyomori anymore, and soon after, in the period lasting from 1168 to 1180, numerous conspiracies against Kiyomori began to pop up. The most famous of these was the Shishigatani incident. For context, Taira no Kiyomori had put up residence in Fukuhara, or modern-day Hyogo, in the Seto Inland Sea, where he made a fortune on inland sea shipping lanes. He did not often visit the palace, but he had installed a very strong and reliable spy network of, interestingly, Minamoto turncoats who were in it just for their own profit. This network was also made up of clan allies and, of course, Taira no Kiyomori's sons. These spies discovered that Fujiwara no Narichika, his son Fujiwara no Naritsune, Fujiwara no Moromitsu, also known as the monk Saiko, Taira no Yasuyori, Tada no Kurando Yukitsuna, and the monk Shunkan, and others, all got together and held a secret meeting in a small country house in Shishigatani, a rural village to the northwest of the capital, to conspire to overthrow Kiyomori and the Taira clan as a whole. This is some of the juiciest political intrigue in the entire story leading up to the Genpei War, because we have Fujiwaras, who we know are, of course, going to be enemies of the Taira clan, but we also have monks, and we have a Taira turncoat, who also likely had struck a deal with the Fujiwara, and other minor co-conspirators. Not to give it all away, but the plot was discovered, and nothing came of it. Taira no Kiyomori's spies discovered the plot, and he took vicious revenge on them. He even tortured and executed the Fujiwara monk Saiko, and killing a monk is one of the 5 grave sins in Buddhism that lands you in the deepest of deep hells, and so this was seen as the most heinous thing he could have done in the whole situation. It was even said that Saiko's vengeful ghost was responsible for deaths in the palace. That is more or less the end of the Shishigatani conspiracy, but the thing that interests me the most about this conspiracy is why were there monks present in it? Obviously, we expect Fujiwara characters to be there. That explains why Saiko was there. But what about Shunkan? Well, as it turns out, Shunkan himself was a Minamoto. So their alliances obviously make sense, but they were still monks. And why are these monks exerting so much power and influence, and why are they conspiring in the political affairs of the palace? The answer speaks to the unraveling of political power in the final years of the Heian period. As we've mentioned, the Buddhist ordination system was inextricably linked to the imperial family and to the court. There is no such thing as separation between church and state. In medieval Japan, the emperor served the triple role of ruling the people, placating and worshipping the kami in what would eventually come to be called Shinto, and propagating the Buddhist Dharma throughout the land. He was regarded as a living kami, a bodhisattva, and a head of state, all in one. Buddhist institutions flourished under imperial court sponsorship. Many nobles and even imperial family members became patrons of monasteries and temples, and many of them even became monks themselves in their older age. With the cloistered government system we've been operating in, and with the political intrigue of the period, We have a lot of members of the most elite noble clans and of the imperial family becoming monks and yet still participating in power brokerage and wheeling and dealing in the court. I am the imperial regent, and my son is the head monk of the Tendai headquarters at Hiezan. If I want the temple or the monks at Hiezan to do something, I'll call up my cousin there on my iPhone 14 Pro Max, because they definitely had those, look it up, and we will work it out together. So that explains the political role of the monastics. But what about the military role? If you remember, I mentioned that monastic soldiers were involved in the Heiji Rebellion. I sort of left that hanging, but I would like to go back to it to discuss how we ought to make sense of this seeming contradiction of terms, monastic and soldier. The true origins of the monastic soldiers are unclear. It seems that by the time of Kiyomori's life, major temples and shrines hired armed guards to protect the temples from local banditry and malcontents and such. The terms of this agreement were that while these armed guards worked for the temple, they were not monks themselves. Eventually, entire companies of these armed guards congealed together. These would be analogous to being a lay brother or sister to a Christian church. However, somewhere along the way, these companies of lay warriors ended up receiving ordination. Or maybe monks from the temples started joining them, or being recruited by them. It's not clear, but the result was bands of soldiers who were ordained monks. Importantly, these guys were not hired by the higher ecclesiastical authorities, and their actions did not always reflect the affiliations and agendas of the temples themselves, which would prove catastrophic later on. The fact that these bands of Sohei, as they were called, existed is reflective of the fact that the military class was gaining ever more power, and that armed conflict was naturally going to become more prevalent. And as a religious and political force, Buddhist temples were always going to play a role in that milieu. These bands of soldiers were called Sohei, as I mentioned, which literally translates to soldier monk, and they were weak and incompetent compared to the warriors of the aristocracy. While they were one of the noteworthy fighting forces in the Heiji Rebellion, and would also play a large role in the upcoming Genpei War, they were still always somewhat ineffectual. So, back to Taira no Kiyomori. The year is 1177, 3 years before the outbreak of the Genpei War, and tensions have never been higher. Kiyomori has just put down the Shishigatani conspiracy and tortured and killed a Fujiwara monk involved in it. This did not go over well in the palace. Go Shirakawa was very uncomfortable with this, leading to very concrete animosity between him and Kiyomori. While they had previously been sort of distancing themselves from each other, particularly Go Shirakawa from Kiyomori, now Go Shirakawa had cause to stand fully against Kiyomori and the entire Taira clan. Furthermore, feeling that Go Shirakawa had been pulling the strings behind the Shishigatani conspiracy, Taira no Kiyomori turned his attention to defeating Go Shirakawa, defeating the Fujiwaras, and ending the entire cloistered rule system once and for all. If you're Taira no Kiyomori, this system has been a thorn in your side for so long, and you must be so tired of it. He has gone from wanting to be the one in control of all the levers of power to wanting to bring the whole machine crashing down. His position is nerve-wracking, even to read about almost 900 years later, because he has pissed off nearly every powerful clan in the palace, including members of his own clan who have turned coat to work for the Minamoto and Fujiwara clans. How does he have a snowball's chance? Don't forget that he is essentially the dictator of Japan at this point. He exerts influence over the emperor. He has his own children installed in the majority of positions of power in the government. He has Fujiwara allies as well, because the Fujiwara clan is enormous, and he even has some Minamoto turncoats of his own. Also, the Taira clan, especially since relocating to Fukuhara, had made huge fortunes in trading with China. In doing so, they also developed many cities along the coast in the west of Japan. For example, Hiroshima grew a great deal during Kiyomori's lifetime. Since renouncing, he also traded and donated holy text and art to religious institutions, making allies with the monasteries, shrines, and temples. Hindsight is 20/20, and by the end of this, you'll know why I say that, and we'll come back to it, but I think that Kiyomori feels pretty secure in his position. I know that we've been telling this story from the perspective of Taira no Kiyomori, and we will continue to do so, but never forget that the Genpei War, and medieval Japanese history in general, is a story also about how the Fujiwara clan constantly plays both sides so that they always come out on top. Just know that they are frequently operating under the radar. They are a giant family, and they have many alliances that cross many sides of different conflicts, and so they're always going to be present whenever there's power brokerage going on. So, Kiyomori spent a couple of years after 1177 consolidating his position and mustering his forces, just waiting for the right moment to strike. Then, when Kiyomori's son and daughter, Taira no Shigemori and Moriko, died in 1179, Go Shirakawa seized some of their family property. This was enough in Kiyomori's mind to justify making his move on Go Shirakawa in 1179. He marched with a force of soldiers from Fukuhara to the capital. Once there, he forced Go Shirakawa into house arrest, and he banished, fired, and demoted many of the high-ranking officials of the government and forced them to resign because they opposed the Taira and worked against them in the past. If I had a nickel for every time Go Shirakawa was put into house arrest up to this point, I would have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. Emperor Takakura, seeing which way the wind was blowing, abdicated, and his ill-fated 2-year-old son Antoku, grandson of Taira no Kiyomori, took the throne. At this, while Kiyomori's position seemed very secure, he is said to have succumbed to a great deal of anxiety and uncertainty. Circumstances look fraught and tenuous to us now, knowing how the story ends, but there were indicators even to Kiyomori at the time that things weren't going well. First, Taira no Kiyomori offended one of his most significant religious allies by turning them into a self-serving PR backdrop. Kiyomori took Takakura and his religious allies on a big and very public pilgrimage to Itsukushima to visit the temples and shrines there, and this totally alienated the monks from Kiyomori. It wasn't because they were upset that Kiyomori was making a political move and attempting to be seen by the people as being wholly with a political ally. As we mentioned, the religious institutions were political ones as well. What bothered them was that he showered all of this wealth on these temples and then turned around and showed them off as status symbols to his powerful friends and allies. Additionally, there was a very ill omen during Antoku's enthronement, where apparently a madman busted into the throne room during a particular portion of the ceremony and was screaming and raving nonsense. At the same time, the Minamoto clan leadership was consolidating against the Taira, particularly Minamoto no Yorimasa, who had previously been strongly allied with the Taira and with Kiyomori in particular in previous engagements. Yorimasa had stuck with Kiyomori through the Hogen and Heiji uprisings and the Shishigatani conspiracy. Kiyomori had even recommended Yorimasa for a promotion in the government, even though he was a Minamoto. Yorimasa was one of the strongest Minamoto allies to the Taira clan. Even so, Yorimasa betrayed Kiyomori. After his government promotion, Yorimasa began recruiting allies in an uprising against the Taira. He sent letters to Minamoto leaders out in the country, particularly to the east, including Minamoto no Yoritomo, who will become very important in the next episode. He also sent out to the religious institutions who were becoming increasingly hostile to Kiyomori. He tried to gather forces for a nationwide insurrection or rebellion to try and overthrow the Taira regime. Yorimasa even spoke to his allies of a candidate for the throne for when these forces had accomplished their goal of forcing Antoku to abdicate. Yorimasa wanted Go Shirakawa's son, Prince Mochihito, to take the throne. Mochihito had been passed over for the throne twice, first when Takakura, the Taira emperor, ascended the throne, and then again when Takakura abdicated and Antoku ascended. Historian Stephen Turnbull argues that after this, Mochihito was just looking for a reason, any reason at all, to rise up and destroy the Taira clan and restore the Go Shirakawa lineage. So he allied with Yorimasa, who was gathering up Minamoto forces and allies for a rebellion. Kiyomori, of course, found out about this whole plot with his spy network and tightened security around Go Shirakawa, put out an arrest warrant for Mochihito, and strengthened his forces in the capital. Because Taira no Kiyomori did not learn everything about this plot, he actually sent Yorimasa to go get Mochihito. He did not yet know that Yorimasa had betrayed him at this point. In this moment, Yorimasa revealed his betrayal by burning down his Kyoto home and joining the prince, who he knew to be at Mii-dera, a temple to the southwest of Lake Biwa, near Kyoto. He took with him a small force of Minamoto warriors. In trying to escape arrest by the Taira, Mochihito and Yorimasa took their Minamoto forces and some allies from Miidera and rode hard with their small contingent to Uji on the way to Nara. Uji is a small town east of Kyoto that sits upon the Uji River about 20 kilometers south of Miidera. Uji village also sits on one side of a grand bridge spanning the Uji River. Yorimasa and Mochihito crossed the bridge and destroyed part of it after themselves, only to be caught up by a huge Taira force on the other side of the river, commanded by Taira no Tomomori, Kiyomori's son. The Uji River runs from northwest to southeast, and Yorimasa had crossed to the southwest side of the river overnight, near the famous Byodo-in, and the Taira forces caught up and assembled on the northeast side of the river. In the misty early dawn light, the Taira let loose a war cry, and the Minamoto contingent let loose theirs in response. On that cliffhanger, we will conclude part 1 of our series on the Genpei War. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you for part 2, where we will begin with the first Battle of Uji in 1180, and discuss all the way through the Battle of Kurikara Pass in 1183. Thank you for listening to Nihonshi, a Japanese history podcast. I hope you enjoyed. If you simply can't wait a week for our next episode, you can back us on Patreon at patreon.com/Nihonshi podcast. There you'll get access to early episodes, bonus content, and a special shout out at the top of every episode. Thank you, and I'll see you next time. Thank you all for joining me for a preview episode of Nihonshi, a Japanese history podcast. This show will be written and produced by me, Nick Bright, and will be released in 2026. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.